The fire in the great hall had already burned low when Elena Marsh felt the bond snap into place, and for one perfect heartbeat, she believed her whole life was about to change for the better. She stood at the edge of the gathering, surrounded by wolves from 3 packs who had traveled for the ceremony, and across the crowded hall, her eyes met the eyes of Alpha Damien Cole. The pull between them was instant and undeniable, a rope tied tight around her chest, and she watched his shoulders stiffen as he felt it too. For a moment, neither of them moved. The noise of the hall seemed to fall away, and Elena forgot to breathe. Damien Cole was everything a pack expected in an alpha. Tall, broad, with dark hair that fell over his forehead, and a presence that made lesser wolves lower their eyes without being told to. Elena had heard stories about him since she was a child, how he had taken over the Blackthorn pack at a young age, and grown it into one of the strongest territories in the region. She had never expected to be his mate. She had never expected to be anyone's mate, not really, not with the quiet, careful life she had built as the daughter of the pack's beta. But the bond did not care about expectations. It simply was. She took a step toward him, drawn by something older than thought, and for a moment, she believed he would step toward her too. Instead, he turned his head, and Elena saw the exact moment his jaw tightened, the exact moment something in his face closed like a door. A woman moved to his side. Priya Malhotra, one of the pack's most decorated warriors, dressed in dark green, her hand finding Damien's arm as though it belonged there. Elena watched them together, and felt something cold spread through her stomach, because she understood, before a single word was spoken, that this would not go the way she had hoped. The hall had gone quiet. Wolves could sense a bond forming. It was impossible to hide such a thing in a room full of shifters, and now every eye in the space turned toward the alpha and the stranger he had just bonded with. Elena felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing pressing on her skin. Damien's father, the old alpha who had stepped down 2 years earlier, rose slowly from his seat near the fire. "Son," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "you know what this means. The wolf gods have chosen for you." "I know what a bond is," Damien said. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had already made his decision and did not intend to be moved from it. "It changes nothing." Elena felt the words land like a blow before he even turned to face her directly. She had heard of rejection, of course. Every wolf had heard the old stories, the warnings passed down through generations about mates who refused each other, and the pain that followed. She had simply never imagined she would be the one standing in the center of the hall while it happened to her. "I already have someone," Damien said, and this time he looked at Elena as he said it, his eyes hard and unapologetic. "Priya has stood beside me for years. She has fought for this pack. She has earned her place at my side, and I will not throw that away, because the fates made a mistake." A murmur moved through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, someone let out a short, disbelieving laugh, quickly smothered. Elena's own father, standing near the front with the other betas, took a step forward, as if to intervene, but the old alpha raised a hand, and he stopped. "You would call the bond a mistake," Elena said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her dress, had begun to shake. "I would call it inconvenient," Damien said, "and I would rather be honest with you now than pretend to feel something I don't. You're not what I want, Elena. I'm sorry if that's difficult to hear, but it would be crueler to lie to you." The word difficult rang in her ears long after he had said it, as if it were the smallest possible way to describe what he had just done to her, in front of 200 witnesses. Elena felt heat rise in her face, and she was furious with her own body for wanting to cry, for wanting to shrink, for wanting anything at all in that moment, except to disappear. Priya said nothing, but the small, satisfied tilt of her chin told Elena everything she needed to know about how this had been arranged, how long it had likely been discussed between them before Elena had ever walked into that hall. "She is not even a warrior," Priya said finally, addressing the crowd rather than Elena directly, as though Elena were a subject to be debated rather than a person standing 3 steps away. "What use would she be to an alpha? A Luna needs strength. She needs to be able to stand at his side in a fight, not merely at a feast." The unfairness of it struck Elena so hard that for a moment she could not find words. She had trained, had learned to fight as every wolf in her pack had learned, though she had never sought to be the strongest among them. She had simply lived a quiet life, valued for her steadiness rather than her ferocity. Now that steadiness was being twisted into a weakness, a public accusation, and no one in the hall moved to correct it. "She's right," Damien said, and something about the ease with which he agreed, the total lack of hesitation, told Elena that he had already decided she was not worth defending. "Elena needs to be strong. I need someone who can hold this pack when I cannot. I'm sorry, Elena, truly, but this is not the life for you." Elena looked past him, to her own father, hoping for some flicker of support, some sign that he would speak against this humiliation. But her father's face was carefully blank, the face of a beta who understood, perhaps better than she did in that moment, that challenging an alpha's decision, in front of his entire pack and 2 visiting delegations, was not a battle that could be won that night. "I see," Elena said quietly. She would think, later, that those 2 words were the last calm thing she said for a long time. The hall did not empty quickly. Wolves lingered, some out of genuine sympathy, most out of the same curiosity that draws any crowd to a spectacle. Elena felt their eyes on her as she made her way toward the doors, felt the whispers that started up the moment she passed, imagined how the story would spread through the pack by morning, embellished and repeated, until it bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened. She did not cry until she reached her room. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and let herself shake for exactly as long as it took to admit to herself how much it hurt, and not one moment longer. Her mother found her an hour later, knocking softly, before letting herself in without waiting for an answer, the way mothers did when they already knew what they would find. "I heard," her mother said, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "Everyone heard," Elena said. That was rather the point. Her mother was quiet for a moment, turning Elena's hand over in her own, as though searching for words in the lines of her palm. "It will pass," she said finally. "These things are hard, but the pack has a short memory for other people's pain. In a month, they will have found something else to talk about." "And what happens to me in that month?" Elena asked. "Do I simply live here, in his territory, watching him with her, while everyone waits for the story to grow stale?" Her mother did not answer right away, and that silence told Elena more than any words could have. "You could ask for a lesser position," her mother said carefully. "There are wolves who continue to serve a pack, even after a rejection. It isn't uncommon. You would not be the first." "I know I would not be the first," Elena said. "That isn't the same as wanting to be one of them." She rose from the bed and walked to the window, looking out over the dark shape of the training grounds where she had spent so many hours of her life learning to fight for a pack that had just decided, in the space of a single evening, that she was not worth having. The unfairness of it sat heavy in her chest, but beneath the hurt, something else was beginning to stir, something sharper and more useful than grief. "He called it inconvenient," Elena said, mostly to herself, "as if I were a broken carriage wheel." "Elena, I'm not angry at the bond," she said, turning back to her mother. "The bond isn't something either of us chose. I understand that. What I cannot forgive is that he stood in front of everyone we know and made me sound weak, made me sound unworthy, simply because it was easier than admitting he had already chosen someone else before the fates ever spoke. He didn't have to shame me to reject me. He chose to." Her mother reached for her again, but Elena stepped back, not unkindly, simply needing the space to think. "What will you do?" her mother asked. Elena looked out at the darkness beyond the window, at the borders of a territory that had suddenly begun to feel less like home and more like a cage, with the door standing open. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I know I will not stay here to be pitied. I would rather face whatever is out there alone than spend one more day being the story this pack tells about the woman their alpha didn't want." Her mother did not try to argue with her, not that night. She simply held Elena's hand a while longer, and then left her alone with her thoughts, perhaps sensing that some decisions had to be reached in solitude, without comfort softening the edges. Elena did not sleep. She sat by the window until the sky began to turn gray, running through every version of her life that might still be possible after that night, and by the time the sun rose over the training grounds, she had made her choice. Whatever came next, she would not make it as the woman Damien Cole had discarded. She would make it as someone new, someone she had not yet become, and she intended to find out exactly who that person could be, far away from the pack that had watched her humiliation, without lifting a single hand to stop it. Elena left before dawn had fully broken, while the pack still slept off the last of the ceremony's food and drink. She packed only what mattered, a change of clothes, a little money she had saved, and the small silver pendant her grandmother had given her, shaped like a crescent moon. She did not pack anything that reminded her of Damien, because there was nothing to pack. He had never given her the chance to collect memories worth keeping. Her father met her at the gate, standing with his arms crossed in the cold morning air. She had expected him to try to stop her, or at the very least, to argue that she was making a mistake, acting out of hurt rather than sense. Instead, he simply studied her face for a long moment. "You've already decided," he said. "I have. Then I won't waste breath telling you to stay." He stepped forward and pulled her into a brief, hard embrace. "But I will tell you this. Wherever you go, do not let what happened last night convince you that you are less than you are. That boy's rejection was about his own weakness, not yours." "I know that," Elena said, though she was not entirely certain she believed it yet, not in the parts of herself that still ached from the humiliation of the hall. "Do you have somewhere to go?" "No," she admitted. "But I would rather walk into nothing than stay here and be pitied by everyone who watched last night happen." Her father did not try to change her mind again. He pressed a small folded bundle of money into her hand, more than she had expected him to be able to spare, and told her to send word once she was settled, wherever settled turned out to be. Then he stepped back, and Elena walked through the gate of the only home she had ever known, out onto the road that led away from Blackthorn territory, without looking back even once. The first 2 days were simple enough. She traveled through neutral lands, staying in small human towns where no one recognized her, and no one cared about pack politics. She told herself she was simply putting distance between herself and the pack, that she would decide on a real plan once the sharpest edge of her anger had dulled. But anger, she was discovering, did not dull so easily. It sat in her chest like a coal, and every time she thought of Damien's face, of the careless way he had called the bond inconvenient, the coal burned hotter. On the 3rd day, her luck ran out. She had made the mistake of cutting through a stretch of forest that bordered several territories at once, land that no pack fully claimed, and few wolves patrolled with any regularity. It should have been safe simply because no one wanted it, but Elena had forgotten, in her exhaustion and distraction, that unclaimed land also drew wolves who had been cast out of their own packs for reasons far darker than a broken bond: rogues. She smelled them before she saw them, 3 separate scents overlapping in a way that told her they traveled together, which was unusual and, she realized too late, deliberate. Rogue wolves who ran with others were often more dangerous than lone ones, having found in each other the permission to do things no pack would allow. She tried to change direction, to move quietly away from the scent trail, but the forest floor betrayed her with a single snapped branch, and within moments, she heard movement crashing through the trees behind her. Elena ran. She was not the strongest fighter in her old pack, but she was fast, faster than most wolves gave her credit for, and she used that speed now, weaving between trees, letting the terrain work in her favor. But 3 against 1, in territory she did not know, was not a fight she could expect to win by outrunning them forever. Eventually, her foot caught on an exposed root, and she went down hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. She rolled onto her back in time to see the first of them break through the trees, a lean gray wolf with matted fur, and eyes that held nothing gentle in them. Elena shifted instinctively, her human form giving way to fur and claws, and she managed to meet his first attack with enough force to send him stumbling sideways. But the second wolf was already closing from her left, and she felt teeth close on her shoulder before she could turn to defend herself. Pain exploded through her, sharp and immediate, and she twisted away with a sound that was half growl and half cry, tearing herself free at the cost of torn flesh. She fought as hard as she could, striking out at anything within reach, but she was outnumbered and already bleeding, and she understood, with the cold clarity that comes only in genuine danger, that she might not survive this stretch of unclaimed forest. It was the sound of new howls, distant but closing fast, that saved her. The rogues heard it too, and something in the tone of those howls made them hesitate, then break away entirely, melting back into the trees rather than risk whatever was coming. Elena did not have the strength to wonder why. She simply lay where she had fallen, blood soaking into the leaves beneath her, and let her vision blur toward darkness. The last thing she registered clearly was the shape of a large, dark wolf standing over her, and a voice, low and urgent, telling her to hold on. Elena woke slowly, pulled up out of darkness by the low crackle of a fire and the dull, steady ache in her shoulder, where the rogue's teeth had torn into her. For a moment she did not know where she was, and panic rose fast in her chest, before her mind caught up with her senses. She was lying on a narrow bed in an unfamiliar room, her shoulder bandaged with careful, practiced hands, the scent of unfamiliar pine and wood smoke thick in the air. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, a wave of dizziness forcing her back against the pillow. "You should stay still," a voice said from near the door. "You lost a fair amount of blood." Elena turned her head and found a man standing there, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that spoke of years of discipline rather than natural calm. His hair was a dark, warm brown, and his eyes, when they met hers, were watchful in a way that made her feel studied rather than threatened. "Where am I?" she asked. Her voice came out cracked and unfamiliar. "Ravenswood territory," he said. "You crossed our border half dead. My patrol found you a few miles inside the line." Ravenswood. Elena knew the name, of course. Every wolf in the region knew of the long, uneasy rivalry between Ravenswood and Blackthorn, two packs that had circled each other for years, without ever quite tipping into open conflict. It would have been almost funny, if her shoulder didn't hurt so badly, that she had run from one and collapsed directly into the arms of the other. "You're lucky," the man continued. "A few more minutes and the blood loss would have been serious. As it is, you'll heal, though it may take a few days before you're back on your feet properly." "Thank you," Elena said, and meant it, though something in her still felt wary, uncertain of how much kindness came without a price attached. "I don't want to be trouble. I'll leave as soon as I'm able." "You're not trouble," the man said, and something in his tone suggested he found the idea faintly amusing. "You're a guest, for now. I'm Kian Ravenswood." The name landed with the weight it deserved. Elena had heard of Kian, the alpha who had taken over Ravenswood territory some years earlier, known for running his pack differently than most, with less rigid hierarchy and, if the rumors were to be believed, considerably less patience for cruelty among his own ranks. She had never expected to meet him lying wounded in his own territory, having fled her own pack in disgrace only days before. "Elena Marsh," she said, "from Blackthorn." Something shifted in Kian's expression at the mention of her old pack's name, though he was careful not to let it show fully. Elena wondered, not for the first time, whether wolves could sense the mark of rejection the way they sensed a forming bond, and whether Kian already understood exactly why a Blackthorn wolf had been running alone through unclaimed forest, with no escort and no destination. "You don't have to explain anything to me," Kian said, as if reading the direction of her thoughts. "Rest. We can talk about your plans once you're steadier." He left her alone after that, and Elena lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the quiet sounds of a pack she did not know, moving through a den that was not hers, and found, to her surprise, that she did not feel afraid. Exhausted, wounded, uncertain of what came next, yes, but not afraid. There was something in the careful, undemanding way Kian had spoken to her that suggested Ravenswood territory, whatever else it might be, was not a place that intended to use her weakness against her. Over the following days, as her shoulder slowly knit itself back together, Elena began to piece together fragments of life in the Ravenswood pack. A young woman named Freya, who brought her food and changed her bandages, chatted easily about pack matters, without ever prying into Elena's own story, seeming to understand instinctively that some things needed to be offered rather than extracted. An older wolf named Callum, who Elena gathered served as Kian's second, checked on her progress with brisk efficiency but no unkindness. And Kian himself visited each evening, never staying long, never asking the questions Elena feared most, simply sitting nearby while she ate and answering, when she asked, whatever questions she had about the pack and its territory. It was on the fourth evening, when her shoulder had healed enough that she could sit upright without wincing, that Elena finally asked the question she had been avoiding. "You know, don't you," she said, "about Blackthorn, about what happened before I ended up bleeding on your border?" Kian was quiet for a moment, turning a small piece of wood over in his hands, a habit she had noticed he had when considering his words carefully. "I know enough," he said finally. "The mark doesn't lie. And frankly, Blackthorn's alpha has never struck me as a wolf with particularly good judgment. Elena let out a short, surprised laugh, the first real laugh she had managed in days. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. I try to be diplomatic about my rivals, Kian said, a faint smile touching his mouth. Publicly, at least. And privately. Privately. I think a wolf who would humiliate someone in front of 200 witnesses rather than simply have an honest conversation is a coward wearing an alpha's title. He said it plainly, without heat, as though stating a simple fact rather than an opinion, and something in Elena's chest loosened slightly at hearing someone finally say aloud what she had felt but not dared voice, not even to her own mother. I don't want your pity, Elena said quietly. Good, Kian said, because I'm not offering any. You survived a rejection and a rogue attack in the same week, and you're sitting here arguing with me, instead of curled up feeling sorry for yourself. That doesn't strike me as someone who needs pity. Elena studied him for a long moment, this alpha of a rival pack who had pulled her out of the forest and given her a place to heal without asking anything of her in return, who spoke to her not as a broken thing to be handled carefully, but as a person whose strength he had already taken for granted. Thank you, she said again, and this time the words carried more weight than gratitude for a bandage, for not treating me like I'm something to be fixed. You're not broken, Elena, Kian said. You're just between one life and the next. There's a difference. He left soon after, as he always did, and Elena lay awake that night turning his words over in her mind, aware, faintly, of a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with her healing shoulder and everything to do with the quiet, steady attention of a man she had known for only a handful of days. By the end of her second week in Ravenswood territory, Elena's shoulder had healed enough that she could move freely, and with healing came a restlessness she had not expected. She was not built for idle days spent recovering in a borrowed room, and one morning, rather than wait for permission, she made her way to the training grounds where a group of Ravenswood warriors were already sparring in the cool morning air. Callum spotted her first, raising an eyebrow as she approached the edge of the training circle. Looking for something, Blackthorn? Elena, she corrected. And yes, I'd like to train, if that's allowed. Your shoulder only just healed. My shoulder is fine, she said, and I would rather use my hands for something other than folding blankets. Callum studied her for a long moment, the kind of assessing look she remembered from her own pack's warriors, before something in his expression shifted toward approval. Kian said you weren't considered much of a fighter back home. Kian is repeating gossip, Elena said, keeping her voice light despite the small sting of the words. I was never given the chance to prove otherwise. My pack decided long ago what kind of wolf I was, and never bothered to look closer. Then prove it here, Callum said, gesturing toward the circle. We don't much care what you were called somewhere else. It was, Elena would think later, one of the kindest things anyone had said to her in weeks, delivered with no softness at all, simply a plain offer of a fair chance. She stepped into the circle and spent the next hour being thoroughly, humbling, outmatched by warriors who had trained together for years, but she did not quit, and by the time the session ended, sweat-soaked and sore in entirely new places, she felt something she had not felt since the night of her rejection. Pride, small but real, in her own effort. She returned to the training grounds the next day, and the day after that, and slowly, over the following weeks, her body began to remember skills she had let go soft from disuse, and her mind began to sharpen with the particular focus that came from having something worth working toward. Freya took to training beside her most mornings, and the two women developed an easy friendship built on shared effort rather than shared history, which suited Elena fine, since she had no particular wish to relive her history with anyone. Word of her progress reached Kian, as word tended to travel through any pack, and he began appearing at the edges of the training grounds more often than his duties as alpha strictly required. Elena noticed, though she said nothing, the way his attention would settle on her during a match, the small, approving nod he gave when she landed a difficult strike, the careful distance he kept, even as that distance seemed to shrink week by week. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Kian fell into step beside her as she walked back toward the den, offering her a water skin without comment. You've improved considerably, he said. I had good reason to, Elena said. It's difficult to feel weak in front of people who keep telling you that you aren't. You were never weak, Kian said. You were simply surrounded by people who benefited from convincing you otherwise. There's a difference, and I think you're only now beginning to understand it. Elena glanced sideways at him, struck again by how easily he said such things, as though the truth of her own worth were something obvious, rather than something she had spent her whole life being told to doubt. You say things like that very plainly, she said, as if you've thought about them before. I have, Kian admitted. I spent years watching wolves in other packs get treated as though their value depended entirely on how useful they were in a fight, or how well they served an alpha's ambitions. I decided a long time ago I wouldn't run my pack that way. Is that why you took me in? Elena asked. Because it fit with how you wanted to run things? Kian stopped walking, and Elena stopped with him, aware suddenly of how close they stood, of the low evening light catching the sharp planes of his face. No, he said, quieter now. I took you in because you were injured and needed help, and because it would have made me no better than Damien Cole to leave you to die, simply because you happened to be born into his pack. Everything since then has had nothing to do with politics. Then what has it had to do with? Elena asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, had suspected it for days, in the way her own chest tightened whenever Kian was near, in the way she found herself listening for his footsteps before she consciously admitted to doing so. Kian did not answer right away, and for a moment Elena thought he might simply deflect the question, retreat back into the careful, measured distance he usually kept. Instead, he reached out, slowly enough that she could have stepped away if she wished, and brushed his fingers lightly against her uninjured shoulder. I think you already know, he said quietly. I've felt something shifting between us for weeks now, and I have been careful not to name it, because you have only just begun to trust that you deserve good things again, and I did not want to be another wolf who pushed you toward something you weren't ready for. Elena's breath caught, the admission landing somewhere between her ribs, with a warmth that startled her. I don't know what I'm ready for, she admitted. I trusted a bond once, and it cost me everything I thought I had. I'm not asking you to trust a bond, Kian said. I'm only telling you what I feel, and letting you decide what to do with it, in your own time. They stood together in the fading light a while longer, saying nothing more, and Elena found, walking back to her room alone that night, that for the first time since the haul in Blackthorn territory, she was thinking less about what had been taken from her, and more about what might still be possible ahead. Spring settled over Ravenswood territory in the weeks that followed, and with it came a steady, quiet transformation in Elena that she noticed only in pieces, the way one notices a scar fading, rather than watching the exact moment it disappears. She rose early each morning to train, sparred harder and smarter with each passing week, and began to be trusted with small responsibilities within the pack that had nothing to do with her past as a rejected mate and everything to do with her own growing competence. Callum, who had once studied her with open skepticism, now sought her opinion during border patrol planning, impressed by an instinct for terrain and timing that Elena herself had not known she possessed. Freya had become something like a true friend, the kind who could sit in comfortable silence or laugh over nothing in particular, and Elena found herself, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, genuinely content in the rhythm of her days. Kian remained a steady presence throughout, careful never to push, though the warmth between them had grown into something neither of them bothered denying anymore. They took to walking the northern boundary together most evenings, ostensibly to review patrol reports, though both of them understood by now that the reports were often finished within minutes, and the walk continued regardless. The pack has taken to you, Kian said one evening, as they walked beneath trees, just beginning to bud with new leaves. Callum mentioned yesterday that he'd trust you to lead a patrol on your own. High praise, from him, Elena said, unable to keep the small note of pride from her voice. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean, Kian agreed. Neither do I, for what it's worth. I've watched you rebuild yourself these past months, and I want you to know, I find it remarkable. Elena glanced at him, warmth spreading through her chest, at the simple honesty in his words. I couldn't have done it alone, she admitted. I know that. Whatever I've become here, it happened because your pack gave me room to become it. You did the hard part, Kian said. We only gave you space. The strength was always yours. They had reached a small clearing near the border, a place Elena had come to think of as their own, quiet and private, far enough from the den that they could speak freely without an audience. Kian stopped there, as he often did, but tonight there was something different in the way he turned to face her, a seriousness beneath his usual calm. "Elena," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you decide how you feel about it." Her stomach tightened, old instincts flaring at the seriousness in his tone, memories of another haul, another confession, rising unbidden. "What is it?" "During patrol yesterday, near the old stone marker at the eastern edge, I caught your scent mixed with something else," Kian said slowly. "Something I hadn't noticed before, not clearly, not until we were standing that close together for that long. I think the bond between us isn't only friendship, Elena. I think we might be fated mates." For a moment, Elena could not speak at all. The word mate rang through her like a struck bell, dragging with it every memory of the last time she had heard it, of Damien's cold rejection, of Priya's satisfied smile, of 200 witnesses watching her be discarded. Her first instinct, sharp and immediate, was to step back, to put distance between herself and the possibility of being hurt that way again. "You're certain," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. "As certain as I can be without you feeling it too," Kian said gently. "I wouldn't have said anything otherwise. I know what the word means to you, after everything. I would never have raised it lightly." Elena turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself, as though the evening had suddenly grown colder. "I can't do this again," she said. "I can't stand in front of anyone else and hope they choose me, only to be told I'm not enough. I would rather have nothing than survive that twice." "I'm not Damien," Kian said quietly, though he did not move closer, giving her the space she so clearly needed. "I would never reject a bond simply because it was inconvenient, but I also won't force you to accept something you're not ready for, Elena. If you need time, you'll have it. If you decide this isn't something you want, I'll respect that too, even though it would cost me more than I'd like to admit." His honesty, offered without pressure, without any attempt to convince her otherwise, was somehow more disarming than any argument could have been. Elena turned back to face him, studying the open, patient expression on his face, so unlike the cold certainty she remembered from the night of her rejection. "I need time," she said finally, "not because I don't feel something. I do, and it terrifies me exactly how much. But I need to know I'm choosing this because it's right, not simply because I'm afraid of being alone." "Take whatever time you need," Kian said. "I'm not going anywhere, Elena. Whatever you decide, I intend to still be your friend, and if the fates are patient enough to wait for you, then so am I." Elena nodded, unable to trust her voice for a moment, and together, they stood in the quiet clearing a while longer, saying nothing more, letting the weight of what had just passed between them settle slowly, without demand, into the space they had built together over the past months. The days following Kian's confession passed strangely for Elena, stretched thin between the comfortable rhythm she had built in Ravenswood and the new, uncertain weight sitting in her chest. She continued to train each morning, continued to walk the border most evenings, though she and Kian both, by unspoken agreement, avoided returning to the clearing where he had told her about the bond, giving the moment room to settle rather than demanding it resolve itself too quickly. It was Freya who finally pushed the subject into the open, catching Elena during a quiet afternoon while they mended torn training gear together outside the den. "You've been distracted," Freya said, not looking up from her stitching, "ever since the Eastern Patrol 2 weeks ago. Care to explain, or should I guess?" "You'll guess regardless of what I say," Elena said, managing a small smile despite herself. "Fair point." Freya set her work down, studying Elena with the direct, unhurried curiosity of someone who had earned the right to ask hard questions. "Is it Kian?" Elena's silence answered the question well enough, and Freya let out a soft, knowing sound. "I wondered when one of you would finally say something. Half the pack has been waiting for it since you started walking the border together every evening like you couldn't manage the patrol reports separately." "It's not that simple," Elena said. "He believes we might be fated mates." Freya's eyebrows rose, genuine surprise crossing her face. "And you're not thrilled about that?" "Elena, I've watched you two together. Whatever this is, it isn't one-sided." "I know it isn't," Elena said. "That's not the problem. The problem is that the last time I let myself believe a bond meant something good was about to happen, I ended up alone on the road with a wound in my shoulder, and my whole life in pieces. I'm afraid, Freya. I'm afraid of wanting this as much as I do, because wanting something that much and losing it again might break me in a way I wouldn't recover from. Freya was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully before she spoke again. I can't tell you Kian won't hurt you, she said. No one can promise that about anyone, mate or not. But I can tell you I've known him for years, since before he became Alpha, and I have never once seen him treat anyone the way Damien Cole treated you. He isn't a man who says things he doesn't mean, and he certainly isn't a man who would humiliate someone he cared about in front of others. I know that, logically, Elena said. I do trust him. It's myself I'm less certain of. What if I say yes, and some part of me never stops waiting for the moment it goes wrong? Then you tell him that, Freya said simply. From everything I've seen, he'd rather know exactly where you stand than have you pretend to be further along than you are. That's the whole difference between him and the wolf who hurt you, Elena. Kian actually wants to know you, not just the version of you that's easiest to be around. The words settled into Elena slowly over the following days, turning over in her mind during training, during quiet moments before sleep, until she found that the fear, while still present, had begun to feel less like a wall and more like a doorway she simply had not yet worked up the courage to walk through. She found Kian a week later, near sunset, standing alone at the edge of the same clearing, where he had first told her about the bond, as though some part of him had been waiting there, for her to return on her own terms. I've been thinking, Elena said, coming to stand beside him. I gathered as much, Kian said, though his voice held no impatience, only quiet attention. I'm still afraid, Elena admitted. I want to be honest about that, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve reassurance. I don't fully feel yet. But I've realized these past weeks that being afraid of being hurt again isn't the same as actually being in danger of it. You've given me no reason to expect from you what I got from him. I think it's time I stopped punishing you for a wound someone else gave me. Kian turned to face her fully, something careful and hopeful in his expression. What are you saying, Elena? I'm saying I want to try, she said. Not because the fates decided it for us, though I won't pretend that doesn't matter, but because these past months, watching you, working beside you, talking with you every evening in this exact clearing, I've come to want this, for reasons that have nothing to do with any bond at all. I want to know what it feels like to be chosen by someone who actually means it. Something in Kian's face shifted, a warmth breaking through the careful patience he had maintained for weeks, and he reached for her hand, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she needed to. She didn't. Then let me be clear, Kian said, his voice steady and certain in a way that settled deep in Elena's chest. I choose you, Elena Marsh, not because the fates require it, though I'm grateful they saw fit to bring us together. I choose you because you are steady and clever and stronger than you have ever given yourself credit for, and because these past months have been the best of my life, entirely because you were in them. Elena felt tears rise, not from grief this time, but from something warmer and far more welcome, and she let herself lean into him at last, feeling for the first time in months that she was not simply surviving her life, but genuinely beginning to live it again. News, in a world of shifters, traveled faster than any letter or messenger could carry it, riding instead on scent and rumor and the loose tongues of wolves who crossed pack borders for trade or gatherings. It did not take long, once Elena had accepted her place beside Kian, for word to drift back toward Blackthorn territory that the woman Damien Cole had so publicly rejected was not only alive and well, but thriving, as the intended mate of his greatest rival. The news reached Damien on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, delivered by a trader who had no idea of the weight his casual gossip carried, until he saw the Alpha's face change. Damien said nothing for a long moment after the trader left, staring out over his own training grounds with an expression that his own warriors, watching from a distance, would later describe as something between disbelief and fury. His relationship with Priya, in the months since the ceremony, had not unfolded the way either of them expected. The pack that had once seemed so eager to accept her as their future Luna had grown quietly critical, murmuring about the cruelty of the rejection they had all witnessed, wondering aloud whether an Alpha who could humiliate one woman so easily might one day do the same to another. Priya, sensing the shift, had grown sharp and demanding in ways that left Damien increasingly weary of a bond that, unlike the one he had rejected, had never actually been fated at all. He had told himself, in the months since Elena left, that he had made the correct choice, that Aluna needed strength above all else, and that Priya's proven skill in battle made her the better match, regardless of what the fates had decided. But the news that Elena had not only survived but flourished, had become someone respected enough to be chosen as Luna by an alpha as formidable as Kian Ravenswood, cracked something in that careful self-justification that Damien had not expected to crack. "She's alive," he said aloud, mostly to himself, standing at the window of his den, and thriving, with him, of all wolves. His beta, who had served the pack since Damien's father's time, chose his next words carefully. "It seems the fates were not so easily discouraged," he said. "Perhaps it is worth considering, Alpha, what it means that a second bond has formed for her at all. Such things are rare." "I'm aware of how rare it is," Damien snapped, more sharply than he intended. He had, in truth, thought of little else since hearing the news, turning the matter over in his mind with a growing, uncomfortable sense that he had discarded something valuable in a moment of pride and never properly understood its worth until someone else had claimed it. Priya found him later that evening, and something in his distracted, distant manner clearly troubled her enough to raise the subject directly. "You've heard about the Marsh girl," she said, not phrasing it as a question. "Elena," Damien said, and something in the way he used her name, rather than the dismissive title Priya had chosen, made her eyes narrow slightly. "Does it matter what she's called?" Priya asked. "She's found a new pack, a new mate. Good for her. I fail to see why it concerns us." "It concerns me because I made a choice that night, and I told myself it was the right one," Damien said. "I'm no longer certain that it was." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had expected, and Priya's expression hardened into something colder than Damien had seen from her before. "Say what you mean, Damien." "I mean that I rejected a genuine bond in favor of a match I told myself made more strategic sense," Damien said, his voice low, almost as though he were confessing something to himself as much as to her. "And now I discover that the woman I discarded has not only survived without me, but has been chosen again, this time by a wolf the entire region respects. It makes a man wonder what exactly he was so eager to avoid." "You're doubting us," Priya said flatly, "because of gossip about a rival's new mate." "I'm doubting myself," Damien corrected. "There's a difference, though I understand why you might not want to hear it." Priya said nothing further that evening, though something between them had shifted permanently, a crack widening that neither of them would be able to fully close again. Damien, for his part, spent the following days in a restless, brooding state that his pack noticed and quietly discussed among themselves, wondering aloud what had prompted such a sudden change in their alpha's mood. It was 2 weeks later, after word arrived that a formal gathering was planned near the border between Ravenswood and Neutral Territory, an event where representatives from several packs traditionally exchanged trade agreements and settled minor disputes, that Damien made the decision that would set the final events of Elena's story into motion. He announced that he would attend personally, accompanied by a small honor guard, insisting to his beta that it was simple diplomacy, nothing more. His beta, who had served under him long enough to recognize the difference between diplomacy and obsession, said nothing to contradict him, though privately he suspected his alpha's true purpose had far less to do with trade agreements than with the woman he intended to see there. The gathering took place in a wide clearing that marked the neutral ground between territories, a place where old traditions dictated that no wolf could raise a hand against another without triggering consequences that would draw every pack in the region into judgment. It was there, among traders and betas exchanging polite formalities, that Damien finally saw Elena again for the first time since the night of her rejection. She stood beside Kian, dressed simply, but with an unmistakable confidence in her bearing that struck Damien more forcefully than he had expected. Gone was the uncertain young woman who had stood in his hall months earlier, replaced by someone who carried herself like a wolf, who knew exactly what she was worth, and no longer needed anyone else's approval to prove it. Kian's hand rested lightly at the small of her back, a gesture of quiet partnership rather than possession, and the two of them moved through the gathering with the easy familiarity of people who had built something real together. Damien felt something twist painfully in his chest at the sight, a feeling he was reluctant to name but recognized, uncomfortably, as regret sharpened by something closer to longing than he wanted to admit. He waited until a lull in the formal proceedings before approaching, ignoring the warning glance his beta shot him from across the clearing. Elena saw him coming and did not flinch, did not look away, simply watched him approach with a calm, unreadable expression that unsettled him more than open hostility would have. "Elena," Damien said, stopping a respectful distance away, "you look well." "I am well," she said simply. "Thank you for noticing, though I confess I'm surprised you bothered to." The dry edge in her voice was new, or perhaps it had always been there, buried beneath the deference she had once shown him, only now allowed to surface fully. Damien felt the sting of it, and, strangely, found himself grateful for the honesty, rather than offended by it. "I owe you an apology," he said, quieter now, aware of Kian's watchful presence just beside her. "What I did that night, in front of everyone, it was cruel, and I have thought of little else since word reached me that you had survived and found happiness elsewhere. I was wrong, Elena, about the bond, and about you." Elena studied him for a long moment, and Damien found himself hoping, foolishly perhaps, that she might offer him some measure of forgiveness, some acknowledgement that his belated regret meant something. "I appreciate you saying that," she said finally, "but I think you should know that hearing it no longer changes anything for me. I spent months believing your rejection meant something was wrong with me, and it took leaving everything I knew to understand that it never did. I don't need your apology to know my own worth anymore, Damien. I found that on my own, with people who never made me question it in the first place." The quiet finality in her voice landed harder than any anger could have, and Damien found he had no response prepared for it. He had come to the gathering half hoping, he realized now, that some part of Elena still waited for him, still wanted the acknowledgement he had finally worked up the courage to offer. Instead, he found a woman who had built a life entirely without him, who needed nothing from him at all, and the realization settled in his chest like a stone. "I see," he said, echoing, without realizing it, the exact words Elena had spoken to him on the night of her rejection. Kian, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable warning beneath its steadiness. "I think this conversation has reached its natural end, Damien. Elena has answered you honestly. I would suggest accepting that answer with whatever dignity you have left." Damien looked between them, at the easy trust visible in every line of their bearing, and felt something inside him curdle into a bitterness he was not proud of, but could not quite suppress. "You think this ends here," he said. "You think I'll simply walk away and let you keep what should have been mine." "She was never yours to keep," Kian said evenly. "You made that choice yourself, in front of 200 witnesses. I would think carefully, Damien, before deciding to make a scene twice in one lifetime over the same mistake." The warning in his voice was unmistakable, and for a moment, Damien looked as though he might push the confrontation further. But the neutral ground held its old power even over wounded pride, and after a long, tense moment, he turned and walked away without another word, though the look he cast back over his shoulder told Elena, more clearly than any speech could have, that this would not be the last time their paths crossed. True to the warning in his eyes, Damien did not let the matter rest. Within days of the gathering, word reached Ravenswood territory that Blackthorn had formally invoked an old law, rarely used but still recognized among the packs, that permitted a rejected mate's original claimant to challenge for reconsideration if evidence could be shown that the rejection had caused harm to the pack or to the fated bond itself. Callum brought the news to Kian and Elena personally, his expression grim as he laid out the details. "It's an obscure statute," he said. "Most packs have quietly ignored it for generations, since it invites exactly this kind of chaos. But it's still technically valid, and Damien has invoked it formally, which means it has to be addressed before the regional council, or it becomes a matter for the packs themselves to settle." "Settle how?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Traditionally, through challenge," Callum said. "Between the two alphas involved, winner keeps the claim." Elena felt anger rise fast and hot in her chest, sharper than fear. He would risk lives, risk everything, simply because he cannot accept that I chose to leave him behind. He would risk lives because his pride cannot accept losing something publicly a second time, Kian said, his voice tight with restrained frustration. It has very little to do with you specifically, Elena, and everything to do with how he believes he'll be perceived if he allows this to stand unchallenged. Then I want to be present when this is settled, Elena said firmly. Whatever happens, I will not be treated as a prize to be argued over by two men while I stand silently to the side. If Damien wishes to invoke old laws about claims and challenges, then I intend to remind everyone present that the law also permits the wolf in question to speak for herself. Kian studied her for a long moment, something like pride mixing with concern in his expression. You're certain? More certain than I've been about anything in a long time, Elena said. I ran once, Kian, and I don't regret it, because running led me here. To you, to this pack, to a version of myself I actually respect. But I won't run again simply because Damien has decided to make a spectacle of his own regret. This time, I intend to stand and face it directly. The regional council, when convened, met at the same neutral clearing where the gathering had taken place weeks before, though this time, the atmosphere carried none of the easy commerce and diplomacy of before. Wolves from half a dozen packs gathered to witness the proceedings, drawn by the rare spectacle of two prominent alphas contesting a claim in the old style, and Elena felt the weight of their attention settle over her the moment she arrived, achingly familiar to the humiliation she had endured in Damien's hall months earlier. This time, however, she stood beside Kian rather than alone, and the difference in how it felt was profound. Damien arrived with Priya at his side, though something in the stiffness between them suggested their bond, whatever it had once been, had frayed considerably in the months since Elena's departure. He looked, Elena thought, older than she remembered, worn down by whatever internal conflict had driven him to this drastic measure. The council's presiding elder, an aged wolf named Osric who had overseen dozens of disputes in his long tenure, called the proceedings to order with brisk efficiency. Damien Cole of Blackthorn has invoked the old statute of contested rejection, claiming that harm has resulted from his initial decision and seeking reconsideration of the bond. Kian Ravenswood, as the current claimant, has the right to respond, as does the wolf whose bond is in question. I will respond, Kian said, stepping forward. But I believe the wolf in question deserves to speak first, as is also her right under the very law Damien has chosen to invoke. A murmur of surprise rippled through the gathered crowd. It was not common for an alpha to yield the floor so readily, and Elena felt a fresh wave of gratitude toward Kian for understanding, without needing to be told, exactly what mattered most to her in this moment. Osric nodded his assent, and Elena stepped forward into the center of the clearing, aware of every eye upon her. Aware, too, this time, that she did not need to shrink beneath that attention. Months ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing, I stood in a hall much like this gathering, having just discovered that I shared a fated bond with Damien Cole. I remember hoping, in that moment, that I might finally belong somewhere fully. Instead, I was told, in front of 200 witnesses, that I was inconvenient, that I lacked the strength to stand beside an alpha, that the bond itself had been a mistake. She paused, letting the words settle, watching Damien's expression tighten with something between shame and defiance. I left that night with nothing but the clothes I carried, and the conviction that I would rather face the unknown alone than remain somewhere I was so clearly unwanted, she continued. I was injured, crossing into Ravenswood territory, attacked by rogues who nearly ended my life entirely. I survived, because Kian found me, and chose to help a stranger from a rival pack, simply because it was the right thing to do, not because any bond demanded it of him. She turned, meeting Damien's eyes directly. In the months since, I have trained. I have earned the respect of a pack that owed me nothing, and I have discovered a bond with Kian that grew not from fate alone, but from months of honesty, patience, and genuine care. Damien, you did not lose me because the fates changed their minds. You lost me the moment you decided it was easier to humiliate me than to have an honest conversation about what you wanted. I do not believe you are here today because you have discovered new love for me. I believe you are here because you cannot accept that someone you discarded found value elsewhere, that you were never willing to offer. The clearing had gone utterly silent, the weight of her words settling over the gathered wolves with a force that no amount of formal argument from either alpha could have matched. Priya, standing at the edge of the crowd, had gone pale, and several members of Damien's own honor guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly reconsidering their loyalty in light of what they had just heard confirmed so plainly. I do not ask the council to punish Damien for his original decision, Elena continued, turning back to address Osric and the assembled elders. People make mistakes, even cruel ones, and I have no wish to build my new life around punishing him for his old one. But I ask that this council recognize what is plainly true, that I am not a claim to be contested, not property to be argued over between two alphas. I am a wolf who has chosen, freely and clearly, where I belong. I ask that my choice be respected, as the law also demands. Osric let the silence stretch for a long moment after Elena finished speaking, his weathered face unreadable as he considered the weight of what had just unfolded in front of the assembled packs. Finally, he turned to Damien, his voice carrying the particular gravity of an elder who had presided over enough disputes to recognize when the true matter at hand had already been settled by something other than formal argument. Damien Cole, Osric said, you invoke this statute, claiming harm had resulted from your original rejection. Yet the wolf in question has just stood before this entire gathering and testified that she suffered greater harm from the manner of your rejection than from the rejection itself, and that whatever harm she endured led her to a life and a bond she considers superior to the one she lost. I confess I struggle to see what claim remains for this council to consider. The bond was fated, Damien said, though his voice had lost much of the certainty it carried when the proceedings began. That alone should carry weight. A fated bond is a beginning, not a guarantee, Osric said. The old laws have never claimed otherwise. Fate brings two wolves together. What they build from that beginning is entirely their own responsibility. You were given that beginning, Damien, and you discarded it publicly and without mercy. I fail to see why this council should now compel a woman, who has since built something real elsewhere, to return to a man who so plainly did not value what he was given. A ripple of agreement moved through the gathered crowd, and Elena watched, with something like quiet vindication, as several of Damien's own pack members exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly reassessing their alpha's judgment in light of the elder's blunt assessment. There is also the matter, Osric continued, of the second bond itself. Such occurrences are rare, and this council has long held that a genuine second bond, formed after a rejection has already occurred, carries its own legitimacy, particularly when both parties have entered it willingly, and with full understanding of what they were choosing. Kian Ravenswood, do you affirm that your bond with Elena Marsh was entered freely, without coercion, and with her full consent? I affirm it, Kian said, stepping forward to stand beside Elena. More than that, I would say it was entered with more care and consideration than most bonds receive, precisely because we both understood exactly what was at stake in choosing each other. And you, Elena Marsh, Osric said, turning his attention to her once more, do you affirm the same? I do, Elena said, without hesitation, freely, and without a single doubt. Osric nodded slowly, then turned back to address the full gathering, his voice rising to carry across the clearing. This council finds no grounds to compel reconsideration of the original bond. Elena Marsh's testimony stands as sufficient evidence that she has exercised her right to choose freely, and that her chosen bond with Kian Ravenswood was entered with full consent and genuine commitment. The statute invoked by Damien Cole is hereby dismissed as without merit. A murmur swept through the crowd, some relieved, some clearly disappointed at being denied the spectacle of a formal challenge between two alphas. Damien stood frozen for a moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked almost like resignation. This isn't finished, he said, though the words carried none of the force they might have held weeks earlier. I am still an alpha, and I still have the right to challenge for. You have the right to challenge for territory or leadership disputes, Osric interrupted, his patience visibly thinning. You do not have the right, under any law this council recognizes, to challenge for a person who has already declared her own free choice before witnesses. I would advise you, Damien Cole, to consider very carefully what remains of your standing among these gathered packs, before you press this matter any further. A wolf who invokes obscure laws to reclaim what he willingly discarded does not inspire confidence in his judgment as an alpha. The rebuke landed hard, and Elena watched as several members of Blackthorn's own honor guard shifted their weight uncomfortably, clearly reconsidering the wisdom of following an alpha whose judgment had just been so publicly questioned by one of the region's most respected elders. Priya, who had remained silent throughout the entire proceeding, finally stepped forward, her expression a mixture of humiliation and barely restrained anger. "Damien," she said quietly, though not so quietly that those nearby couldn't hear. "I think we should leave, now." Damien looked at her, then at Elena and Kian, standing together, united and unshaken, and something in his shoulders finally sagged, the fight going out of him all at once. "Yes," he said quietly. "I believe we should." He turned without another word and walked from the clearing, his honor guard falling into step behind him, with visibly less enthusiasm than they had shown upon arrival, and Priya followed a few steps behind, her earlier confidence noticeably absent. Elena watched them go, waiting for some surge of triumph or satisfaction to rise in her chest, and was surprised to find instead only a quiet, settled peace, the feeling of a chapter finally closing, rather than a victory being won. She had not needed to defeat Damien to prove her worth. She had simply needed to state the truth clearly enough that everyone present could see it for themselves. Kian's hand found hers, warm and steady, and she turned to find him watching her with open pride. "You didn't need me to fight that battle for you at all," he said. "I've never been prouder of anyone in my life. I couldn't have stood there so calmly if I hadn't spent months rebuilding myself in your pack," Elena said. "This victory belongs to both of us, and to everyone in Ravenswood, who helped me become someone who could stand in that clearing and speak without shaking." Osric approached them as the crowd began to disperse, his weathered face carrying a faint, approving smile. "That was well spoken, young Elena. I have presided over many disputes in my years, but rarely have I seen someone reclaim their own dignity so thoroughly, without needing to raise a single hand in violence to do it." "Thank you, Elder," Elena said. "I only spoke the truth." "The truth, spoken plainly and without fear, is often the most powerful weapon any of us possess," Osric said. "Remember that, both of you, as you build your future together. It will serve you well." He left them then, and Elena and Kian stood together in the emptying clearing, the late afternoon light slanting gold through the trees, both of them aware that something important had shifted permanently, not only for themselves, but for how the surrounding packs would remember the story of the woman who had been shamed, and had chosen, in the end, to answer that shame, with nothing more than the simple, unshakable truth of who she had become. In the weeks that followed the council's decision, word of what had happened in the neutral clearing spread quickly through every pack in the region, carried by traders and travelers, until it had become something close to legend. The story that circulated was not one of two alphas competing for a prize, as Damien had perhaps hoped it might become, but of a woman who had been publicly shamed, and had answered that shame not with anger or vengeance, but with quiet, undeniable truth. Elena found, in the months that followed, that she had become something of a symbol without ever intending to, a name spoken with respect in packs she had never even visited. Back in Blackthorn territory, the fallout from the council's ruling proved lasting. Damien, standing among his own pack, never fully recovered from the elders' public rebuke, and within the year, whispers began circulating that his beta and several senior warriors were quietly positioning themselves to challenge his leadership, unwilling to continue following an alpha whose judgment had been so thoroughly questioned before the entire region. His bond with Priya, already strained before the confrontation, dissolved entirely within months, neither of them willing to maintain a partnership that had been built more on convenience and pride than on anything genuine. Elena heard these things only secondhand, through the same channels of pack gossip that had once carried news of her own humiliation, and found that she felt no satisfaction in Damien's decline, only a distant, settled understanding that consequences, in the end, tend to find their way home, regardless of how long they are delayed. In Ravenswood, life continued with the steady, contented rhythm Elena had come to treasure. She and Kian set a date for their formal bonding ceremony, choosing to hold it not in a grand hall filled with pageantry, but in the same quiet clearing along the northern border, where he had first told her about the bond between them, surrounded only by the pack members, who had become her true family over the preceding months. Freya stood beside her as she prepared, fussing over the simple green dress Elena had chosen, one that bore no resemblance to the elaborate finery worn at the ceremony in Blackthorn all those months earlier. "You look happy," Freya said, studying her in the polished glass they had propped against the wall. "Properly happy, not just relieved." "I am," Elena said, and found, saying it aloud, that the words carried a lightness she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. "I never imagined, on the night I left Blackthorn, with nothing but a change of clothes and my grandmother's pendant, that I would end up here, feeling this settled, this certain of where I belong." "Kian certainly imagined it," Freya said with a grin. "He's been unbearably pleased with himself for weeks." Elena laughed, the sound easy and unguarded, and made her way out to the clearing where the pack had gathered, simple lanterns strung between the trees casting warm light over the assembled faces of people who had become, in every way that mattered, her own. Kian waited for her at the center of the clearing, dressed simply as well, his expression when he saw her approaching carrying none of the careful composure he wore during pack business, only open, unguarded warmth. Callum stood nearby to officiate, and as Elena took her place across from Kian, she found herself thinking not of the humiliation she had endured months earlier, but of every small moment since that had led her, step by careful step, to this exact place. "Elena Marsh," Kian said, taking her hands in his, "I choose you today, as I have chosen you every day since I found you at the edge of my territory, wounded but unbroken. I choose your strength, your honesty, and your steady heart, and I promise to spend every day earning the trust you have placed in me." Elena felt tears rise, warm and welcome this time, and found her own voice steady as she answered him. "Kian Ravenswood, I choose you knowing exactly what I am choosing, without fear and without doubt. You showed me that a bond does not have to be a cage, that it can instead be a foundation, something built with care rather than simply declared by fate. I choose you as my mate, and as the Alpha, I am proud to stand beside as Luna." The ceremony that followed was simple, warm, and utterly unlike the cold, public spectacle of her rejection so many months before. When Callum finally pronounced them bonded before the pack, the clearing erupted into genuine celebration, wolves howling their approval into the night sky, a sound Elena felt in her very bones, a sound that told her, more clearly than any words could, that she had finally found the place where she truly belonged. Later that night, standing at the edge of the celebration with Kian's arm around her shoulders, Elena looked out over the pack that had become her family, and thought back to the woman she had been in that other hall, humiliated and uncertain, believing her worth had been decided by a single rejection. That woman, she realized, could never have imagined the life waiting for her on the other side of that pain. "Any regrets?" Kian asked quietly, following her gaze. "Only one," Elena said, smiling up at him. "That it took me so long to understand that walking away from something that hurt me wasn't losing anything at all. It was simply making room for everything I was always meant to have." She rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the sound of her pack celebrating around them, and felt, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely at peace with exactly who she had become.